So hello, welcome back. Today we are talking about Descartes. I'm Andy, philosophy lecturer, and in this series we are talking about early modern philosophy. And Descartes' life we talked about last time, so if you're interested in Descartes' life, go back there and watch the previous video. Today we will talk about the discourse on the method, which is one of the two big works of Descartes. The other is the Meditations we will talk about next time. The Discourse on the Method is an easy-to-read book. It's fun. It's easy to get into because Descartes begins by describing his personal life, his personal journey, how he went from his scholastic education, Middle Ages, medieval education, to his ideas, to his own philosophy, trying to find a method, and this is why it's called the Discourse on the Method. A method that would guarantee that his philosophy is correct and that he describes the world in the right way. And the basic thought is, of course, that we can be deceived. We never know if what we think, if what we see is correct. Think of the Matrix, for example. Everything could just be an illusion. And how do you know what is really true? Is there any way to make sure that we have true knowledge in a situation like in the Matrix where we are deceived about everything we think is true? And this is the starting point of Descartes. And he goes back to his experiences with school. He was raised in a Jesuit school and a scholastic tradition, which means that he learned all the church fathers of the Middle Ages. He learned Thomas Aquinas. And these people, again, go back to Aristotle with many of their arguments, or to Plato, Neoplatonism. And Descartes is looking at this tradition, and he says at the beginning of the discourse, I read lots of books, these people made me read a lot of books, and I learned all these books, but I actually don't feel like I have learned anything, because for every argument that I find in a book, there's a counter-argument. And one book says the one thing and one book says the other thing. And the more books I read, the less I feel that I actually know anything. And this is an interesting thought, right? It's something that we today surely also have when we engage with philosophy. We have this idea that, or this feeling that the more we learn, the more we read, the less certain we are that any of this is a real truth, right? Philosophy tends to make you into a relativist. You see, there is one position, there's the other position, and both have good arguments. And it's very difficult to find a firm position where you say, okay, now I know this is true, right? Like they do in the science system. Physics can do it, mathematics can do it. Philosophy does not normally go there. But in the time of Descartes, this was the ideal, right? The ideal was physics. Like in astronomy, where you say, I can calculate where the planet will be in 1,000 years, and the planet will be exactly there because astronomy is based on laws that are certain. In the same way, I want to do philosophy, Descartes says. I want to do philosophy in a way that is based on certainties that cannot be questioned. And how do I go about it now? How do I reach such a foundation? And perhaps the most famous sentence comes from the Discourse. And this is the sentence, I think, therefore I am. So this is what we will talk about in a moment. And it is just funny that every one of these philosophers has one motto like that. Those early modern philosophers. They all have one sentence that really characterizes them. And this is also true of the pre-Socratics. It's less true of Plato and Aristotle because they have these very complex, very wide-ranging systems of philosophy that cannot easily be reduced to one sentence. But for our period here, the early modern philosophy, it's really funny how every single philosopher has one sentence that characterizes him. So for Descartes, it's, I think, therefore I am. For Spinoza, it is God or nature. For Leibniz, it is monads don't have windows, and so on. Every one of them has a sentence like this. And this sentence summarizes his whole view of the world, his whole philosophy, his arguments, what this philosopher is about. And so this is what we want to see, this is what we want to talk about. How does he arrive at this statement of his in this book, in the Discourse on the Method. And in the beginning, as I said, he says, I'm unhappy about what I learned. The more I read, the less I feel that I learned. And part of the problem for him is that the knowledge he learns through this scholastic education is kind of knowledge by committee, because it is not knowledge that comes from one thought, one consequent, thinking about reality, but it is knowledge that comes a little bit from here, from there, from many different books. And this is why there is no clear sense of direction in it. It is just a collection of statements, some from Aristotle, some from Thomas Aquinas, some from other church fathers, some from the Bible. And Descartes is fed up with this. And he says, we can see that when a committee does something, it's never as good as when one person does something. So if you have a house or an ancient temple, built by committee, imagine how this would be, right? You would have part of the house look, different from another part of the house, because the different persons responsible for the different parts will have different aesthetic or perhaps different preferences in architecture or in design or in painting their part. And so we would get a house that may even, not even stand, it may collapse, but even if it's actually standing, it will not be a good house. It will be inconsistent. It will have all sorts of contradictions in its design. And this is necessarily the case, Descartes says, of all democratic processes. Even a state will be worse, he says, if it's a democratic state, than if it's organized by one person, if it's organized by a king. We might disagree today, of course, with this, but this is Descartes' idea. And so he says the same is true of philosophy. If I have this whole building of philosophy that's made up from the ancient Greeks and the pre-Socratics and the Bible and the church and then, early modern philosophy and Newton and physics, this is never going to make much sense. We need to find, if we want to find the basis of philosophy, we need to find a basis that is created by one mind with a clear, rational approach to reality, and that leads to clear and distinct findings. And now we come to this sentence, clear and distinct. And this is a very important point, because this has become, for philosophers from the time of Descartes on, a rallying cry for what is certain. Certain is clear and distinct. Descartes starts this at some point. He says it a few times, clear and distinct images in my mind must be true, and I recognize the truth of something because it's clear and distinct. And later this becomes also an important point in Hume and in Locke. They echo Descartes there when they say that impressions and ideas are more reliable if they are clear and distinct. And this goes through all these early modern philosophers. They all in some way pick up this idea of clear and distinct, and you can even find it in the 20th century if you go to the Vienna Circle with Carnap and Schlick. They also have this idea that the only reliable truths about the world, the only things that we can reliably know, are those things that are clear and distinct. And for Carnap, these are protocol statements. What he calls protocol statements means statements that describe sensory impressions at this point in time. When I say this here, now here red, now here white, now here cold, this is a direct description of a sensory impression, and therefore it is reliable because it's so clear and distinct. While when I talk about God or the universe or the meaning of life, then these notions are not clear and distinct, and therefore they are not reliable. And we should get rid of them. We should, Carnap thinks, make philosophy based on these protocol statements. Now, I find this interesting that sometimes, a philosopher like Descartes starts something by saying this clear and distinct thing, and it goes for many, many centuries, and everybody picks it up and they all echo it, and it becomes kind of a part of philosophical lore, this idea that clear and distinct is good, which actually seldom really worked. For Descartes, it didn't work at all, as we will see in a moment. He had to abandon it very early. but also it didn't work for the Vienna Circle. And it is questionable, why is clear and distinct so much better than, unclear and perhaps connected with other notions. Okay, let's go on. Moving on from his life, Descartes gives us a number of principles that he wants to use in order to make sure that his thoughts are well ordered and that are clear enough. And this is something that Spinoza later would also pick up and bring to an even more extreme development. Spinoza, I don't know if you know, but we'll talk about him later, had this idea that he should build philosophy like geometry. So every statement, like in the geometry of Euclid, should be based on a previous statement, and everything should begin with an axiom that is clear and distinct and, unquestionable. And from then on, we should only base new sentences on the previous statements in a deductive way that is entirely clear and cannot be questioned. And Spinoza will do this to an extreme extent. So when you read his philosophy, it looks exactly like geometry. But Descartes doesn't do that, but he creates the seeds of this idea. And perhaps this is why Descartes is always seen, as the father of modern philosophy, because he has all these seeds in his work that later others pick up and continue to work with. But the first one who mentions them is he. And so this is what makes him into this super figure of philosophy, right? That he has the seeds of all these ideas which later become so important to others. So his first principle is to never accept anything as true if you don't have knowledge of its truth. So to not believe books, to not believe second-hand evidence, but to have direct knowledge of the truth of something. His second principle is to divide complex problems or arguments into parts that can be dealt with one by one. So not to attempt, a very difficult problem, but first to divide it and then into smaller problems, and then to track the smaller problems one by one, which is a good idea methodologically, right? To simplify problems and to deal with them in small parts. The third is to keep his thoughts orderly, in an orderly manner, so not to jump back and forth, but to progress in a logical way from one to the next, like we said, like geometry would go. And the last one is to make sure that he has not overlooked anything and that everything follows logically one from the other, so that nothing can be questioned. So following these principles, he hopes that he will be able to build this foundation for philosophy that will be totally unquestionable. And so now we come to the core of his method. Having these principles now, especially the first one, not to believe anything for which he does not have direct evidence and absolute certainty. He goes on to question, okay, what do I know really about the world? Do I know what my senses tell me? If I look at my hand, can I be sure that my hand is really there? And the point is no, I cannot, right? Because I can be mistaken about my hand. I can be deceived. I can be drunk. I can be under the influence of drugs. There are hallucinogenic drugs, right, that will create all sorts of things in your mind that don't really exist. And so I can never be certain just by looking at my hand that the hand is actually there or that it looks like this. I cannot be certain about colors. I cannot be certain about sounds. I cannot be certain about any of my senses. And so his first conclusion is, I chose to suppose that nothing is as my senses tell me because the senses can deceive us. And also I reject all the arguments from previous philosophers because I never know how certain they were when they made their arguments. When Aristotle said something, was he really sure that this thing was true? Or did he just reiterate something that some previous philosopher had said? And perhaps nobody was ever sure of this thing. So if I want to be certain, I have to discard all the previous knowledge. That knowledge, Descartes would say, in quotation marks, because I don't know if it's real knowledge. So the only knowledge I will trust is my own. If I find out something and I'm sure of its truth, then I will stick to that, nothing else. And so now you do this, you take away everything that you think is true or that somebody else thought is true or what the senses tell you is true. And what do you end with? What can you really be certain of? And if you do it really radically, the only thing that remains is one sentence. And now we are at the core of Descartes' project. I think, therefore I exist. What does this mean? I cannot know if my hand looks like that. I cannot know if I'm even Andy. Perhaps I'm just dreaming it. I cannot know if I'm wearing a black t-shirt. Perhaps this is also a dream. So what can I really know? What can I be certain of? And if I look inside myself, the moment I'm thinking, the only thing that I can be certain of is that I'm thinking. This is something I cannot question. Even if everything else is wrong, even if I'm completely mistaken, even if I'm stuck in the matrix and my brain is completely remote controlled by some evil, aliens or computers, the fact that I'm thinking about this question cannot be questioned. I am thinking about it. And therefore, I must exist because I'm thinking. And this is all. This is Descartes' thing. This is Descartes' certainty. And this is great. I mean, it's a great point to start with. But you can see a problem, I think. If you start with so little, if you say the only thing I know is that I exist, then where can we go from there? Because think about, what does the I even mean? In I think, therefore I am. What is the I? Does it mean Andy? No, because Andy may be an illusion. Does it mean this person with the beard and the black t-shirt? No, because all this can be an illusion. So what is I really? And this I then is stripped of everything that is a sensory experience, and what remains is just a mental state. There is something that thinks. And I'm not even sure if there's something in the sense of a material thing. I can only say there's a mental state of thinking. There is a thought. Yeah, that is certain. But that's all. And this does not give me any information about the world, right? I don't know anything more about the world by knowing that there is a thought. So how can I continue from there? And this is Descartes' big problem. So now we are there. We are at this point where Descartes is established that he thinks and therefore something exists, a mental state exists. And from this I can now go into a few directions. I can say, for example, other mental states must exist. If I think, therefore I am, therefore also, if I fear, therefore I am, and if I'm happy, therefore I am. Or there is something that is happy. So I can do the same with other mental states. So I can in this way verify my existence through the existence of these other mental states, and perhaps I can extend my certainty to these mental states. I can say not only I think, therefore I am, but I can also say I think, therefore I think. I feel happy, therefore I feel happy. So this happiness is not fake. It's true because I feel it. But we can never break out of our minds into the real world, because the real world is only perceived through the senses, and we wanted to start by assuming that the senses are not reliable. So I could never actually verify that anything in the outside world exists. And so Descartes then makes another move that is very, very influential in the history of philosophy. He says, if I know that I and my mental states exist, certainly, but I don't know if anything else exists, then this draws a kind of a line between my mental states and everything else, the other parts of the world, the other things in the world. And so this shows me that my soul is special, my mind is special, in the way that I can have complete certainty of it, while I cannot be certain about the world. And I can be certain that my mind has particular properties. It does not have a weight, it does not have an extension, while the world outside has these things. This he doesn't yet say very clearly here in the discourse on the method, but he says at some point that I can distinguish between inside and outside. And I know that my thoughts are not a substance, they are not a thing. And so I can say there is a soul or there is a mind, and on the other hand, there is a body. And this is the dualism of Descartes. This is what later becomes very important in the philosophy of mind. The idea that we have a mind and a body, a soul and a body, however you want to call it, and that these two things are different, they're not the same. And this is called dualism because you have two substances. You have the mental substance and you have the material substance. And these are not the same. And in a later meditation in the other book, Descartes will explain more how this works according to his idea. But even here I will read you a few sentences. He says, accordingly, this me, this soul that makes me what I am, is entirely distinct from my body, is easier to know than my body, and could still be just what it is, even if the body did not exist. Now this, of course, is a Christian thought also, right? The soul is independent of the body, and after the body dies, the soul goes to heaven or wherever. And he needs this, right? Descartes is still a Christian. He grew up in a Christian environment. He was educated by Jesuits. He comes from the Middle Ages. And he cannot just say that the soul does not exist. So the soul does exist, and the soul is different from the body. And this is all you need about the discourse on the method. This is the pinnacle of Descartes' philosophy, this insight. And from now on he will try to rebuild the external world. But this will not work very well, and we will see later what the problems with this are. So thank you for being here, and watch the next video, which will be up here somewhere. And I see you there. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye-bye.